All Horses videos are available early, ad-free, and uncensored on Patreon. Patrons also get access to exclusive videos, merch giveaways, and more. Check it out at patreon.com/horsespt. Horses is an independent creative project that relies on the support of viewers like you. Thank you. Vladimir Nabokov's book Lolita is a story of abuse, misinformation, and unfathomable cruelty. But so often the work has been interpreted, manipulated, and maligned in a way to distance it remarkably from the original source material. Whether you have read Lolita or not, examining the book and its long-standing cultural impact is a tremendous exercise. It is a case study in how we manipulate media, how media can manipulate us, and beneath all of that, we can find the true horror of Nabokov's novel. Lolita tells the story of a man who manipulates, kidnaps, and repeatedly rapes a 12-year-old girl after becoming her stepfather. The book is presented as a memoir written in the first-person perspective by a man under the pseudonym Humbert. The man recalls that as a child he fell in love with a girl named Annabelle. Before this romance developed into anything meaningful, Annabelle died of typhus. Humbert claims that this was the genesis of his erotic and romantic obsession with young girls. At the age of 37, Humbert meets a recently widowed woman named Charlotte. She is looking for someone to lodge in her home, and Humbert, without a place to stay, agrees to tour the residence. During the visit, he meets Charlotte's 12-year-old daughter, Dolores. He describes Dolores as a, quote, perfect nymphette and moves in with Charlotte, only as a means to have sex with her daughter. Charlotte dies and Humbert proceeds to kidnap Dolores, who he has nicknamed Lolita. Humbert drives with Dolores across the United States, regularly molesting her throughout the story. Eventually, Dolores leaves Humbert to be with another older man named Claire Quilty. Dolores refuses to be in a pornographic film Claire is producing and eventually leaves him as well. Later in the story, Humbert kills Claire and is arrested for murder. Dolores marries another man before eventually dying in childbirth. This is a very basic but accurate synopsis of Lolita. However, to truly understand the book and understand how the world basically failed Lolita, we must analyze the work more comprehensively. The first step in understanding Lolita is understanding Humbert. Specifically, we must realize that Humbert is an unreliable narrator, but perhaps not in the traditional sense. The typical unreliable narrator says things that aren't true or recounts events that didn't happen. Everything Humbert says in Lolita did happen, but we are only seeing his interpretation of those events. As an aggressive, violent pedophile, Humbert is inclined to find sexual advances or sexual tension from Dolly where there is none. The entire story is told through the lens of Humbert and his sexual proclivities. So Humbert himself may not even realize that he is an unreliable narrator, but that is immaterial. The fact is this: Humbert does not provide an objective account of the events in Lolita. We know this partially through Humbert's framing of the tale. He confesses to, at time of writing, having been shipped from insane asylum to insane asylum during and after the story. Throughout the tale, Humbert makes multiple visits to sanatoriums, which produce no positive results for his mental health. In one passage, he admits that after a hospitalization, he had, quote, another bout with insanity. Additionally, he regularly tricks psychiatrists into making faulty assessments of his sexuality. So we can say with certainty that Humbert is psychologically unstable. This already calls into question his account of events. Even more egregiously, Lolita shows us that Humbert is also a habitual, perhaps even pathological, liar. In one instance, he tells another character that he has begun a love affair with Dolly's mother, Charlotte. But he also tells the reader that he only moved in with Charlotte to get closer to Dolly, which is in itself an act of dishonesty. Humbert later applies Dolores to a private school claiming to be her father. Throughout Lolita, Humbert's dishonesty is regularly on full display. Furthermore, Humbert's memoir is written as Humbert's defense for a jury. This is the context in which the book exists within its universe. At the time of writing, Humbert is on trial for murder. If anyone had reason to lie, it would be such a person. Humbert's memory is also shown to be remarkably inconsistent. In one instance, he claims to have a, quote, incomplete and unorthodox memory. But throughout the book, Humbert recalls certain scenes with near photographic completeness. Others, meanwhile, are vague, blurred, and haphazardly narrated. We could say this is just the nature of recollection. Everyone has an unreliable memory. This criticism, though, only furthers Humbert's position as unreliable. Because his memory is our sole source of knowledge, we must recognize that what we are reading is inherently unreliable. Here we may be tempted to chalk much of this up to Nabokov's writing. It was Nabokov who wrote Humbert's words. Humbert is a fictional person, and his words are not really his own. But we should acknowledge that Nabokov is a masterful author, and his construction of the chaotic Humbert is very intentional. Nabokov felt so compelled to make this clear that he actually penned a short essay called On a Book entitled Lolita. In this essay, he states that he does not share Humbert's morals or views. Humbert is not Nabokov. He is a carefully constructed character designed to manipulate the reader and obfuscate truth, as we will soon see. So, with all of that in mind, and at the risk of further complicating things, we should realize that Lolita presents us with basically two Humberts, the narrator Humbert and the actor Humbert. The things which Humbert says very often do not match up with the things he has done. In A Reader's Guide to Nabokov's Lolita, Julian W. Connolly goes into great detail about just this topic. The narrator Humbert recounts the events of his memoir. He describes himself and the role he played in the so-called relationship. But of course, Humbert only offers his own perspective, which is faulty at best and horrifically warped at worst, and probably at most accurate. First, we will examine the narrator Humbert, so that we may then remove his mask and meet the monster who truly is Humbert. In the opening pages of Lolita, Humbert attempts to decorate and justify his attraction to preteen girls. He calls himself a nympholept, a word which avoids the blatant cruelty and disgust that would be associated with the term pedophile. Here we will take a pause to investigate an earlier piece of Russian literature, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In this book, the main character believes he is somehow elevated above the rules of man, that there are remarkable individuals to whom convention does not apply. This character commits a murder based on this idea. Nabokov's Humbert follows much in this same template as he describes his ostensible discovery of the nymphette. Humbert attempts to convince us that he is somehow elevated above regular man by virtue of his pedophilia. To identify a, quote, nymphette of the sort he likes, Humbert says that a person must be an artist and a madman. Humbert goes on to describe in flowery detail what qualifies a young girl as a nymphette, fashioning himself as something between a connoisseur and an artist. He tries to align himself with creative greats like the author Dante, noting that Dante fell in love with a 9-year-old girl named Beatrice. Here, Humbert fails to mention that Dante himself was 9 when he met Beatrice. Humbert claims that nymphets are another sex altogether, somehow neither male nor female. He takes a very scientific tone as he describes the nymphette, concluding that he and only a few other select individuals are capable of recognizing the species. Essentially, he is heroizing his own pedophilia. He further aligns his infatuation with dubious historical context. He says it is a natural desire, that it is only societal constructs which prohibit a man from falling in love with a teenage girl. He points to the customs of ancient Rome and Egypt and says that modern society alone doesn't allow him to, quote, court a girl of 12. Of course, Humbert does not court Dolly. He kidnaps her and molests her. The narrator also attempts to provide a psychological justification for his fetish. He says that his childhood romance was interrupted by Annabelle's death and that Dolly could now fill that void. He frames Dolly as somehow special, implying that she alone has some distinct place in his heart. But we also know that up until he met Dolly, Humbert sated his twisted sexual desires by watching nymphets in public parks. In fact, time and time again, Humbert waxes erotic about teenage girls. So it seems that other than actually fulfilling his fantasy, there is very little that is special about Dolly to Humbert. In one of his more remarkably flimsy arguments, Humbert also claims that his desires are a matter of the heart rather than a criminal pursuit. Of course, we could all agree that intent in this case is simply irrelevant. One morning, Humbert engages with Dolly in 3 rounds of, quote, strenuous intercourse, a phrase which seems to scream rape quite loudly. On the back of this admission, Humbert, the narrator, shows himself quite clearly. He claims to have felt remorse and says he felt as if he was sitting next to the ghost of someone he just killed. Poetic, certainly, but then follows a few hundred pages of Humbert kidnapping and molesting Dolly. Whatever grief he claimed to feel, it was apparently quite shallow. Humbert concludes, bizarrely, that he is a good man and that he, quote, had the utmost respect for ordinary children with their purity and vulnerability, and under no circumstance would he have interfered with the innocence of a child if there was the least risk of a row. So here Humbert proclaims he would never hurt a child, with the qualifier of if he would get caught. It is then the punishment rather than the act which Humbert finds disagreeable. Humbert later makes the statement that he only wanted to give Dolly a good time. On the back of this claim, we can examine the actor Humbert, not the man who recounted events, but the man who actually performed them. The truth is quite clear. Dolly did not have a good time. No human of reasonable intellect could honestly claim such a thing. Humbert is a violent sexual abuser. In one incident, Humbert brings himself to orgasm while sitting next to Dolly on the couch. The narrator Humbert claims she felt nothing at all, but the events he described indicate otherwise. The girl shrieks, her cheekbones flush, and she squirms helplessly while Humbert touches her. Humbert later describes this incident as no harm done. We need not describe in detail every kiss and sexual interaction between the pair, but suffice to say, sexual gratification alone is Humbert's driving motivation. To this point, actor Humbert makes it clear that he has no interest in Dolly as a human being. Lolita was not Dolly's name, not in the slightest. No one in Dolores's life ever called her Lolita. By anointing her as Lolita, Humbert actively shoos her identity away. He calls her his own creation with, quote, no life of her own. She is an object for his sexual desires and nothing more. Other than a single sentence that describes her crying every night, the narcissistic Humbert offers absolutely no insight into Dolly's opinions, thoughts, or personhood. Later in the book, when he finally grapples with his ignorance of Dolly as a person, he says her mind was, quote, forbidden to him. So he is not really confessing that he took little interest in the non-sexual Dolly, but rather declaring that Dolly herself is somehow to blame for forbidding him from doing so. Humbert actually expresses regular disdain for Dolly. He calls her a brat and describes her regular, quote, fits of disorganized boredom and vehement griping. Humbert says she is droopy and dopey-eyed. He further describes her as a disgustingly conventional little girl. Throughout the book, Humbert claims to be in love with Dolly, but clearly this is false. Furthermore, Humbert is a manipulator. It is his careful manipulations which propel the story forward and which drive Dolly into his arms. Dolly, Humbert says, is quite infatuated with glamour and exotic ideas of celebrities and movie stars. Humbert is from Europe, and in some way, he says that he may possess a version of this exotic appeal to Dolly. In fact, Dolly has a crush on a famous playwright who Humbert himself is said to resemble, or at least who Humbert claims to resemble. Humbert uses this knowledge to encourage Dolly's interest and escalate their early relationship with ongoing flirtation. When Dolly's mother dies, Humbert intentionally withholds this news from the girl. His plan is rather to deploy the information when he may gain some sexual gratification out of her reaction. Throughout the story, Humbert also employs several methods to keep his, quote, pubescent concubine in submission. He tells her that without him, Dolly the orphan would be locked up in some government institution. As he kidnaps her and drives Dolly around the country, Humbert refuses to let her speak with anyone other than himself. Humbert also pays Dolly for obliging his sexual advances. He offers her 3 cents a day for fulfilling, quote, basic obligations. When she begins to demand more, Humbert calls the request a definite drop in morals. In one instance, he hands her the coins only to pry her hands open and take them back. Beyond Dolly, Humbert also attempts to manipulate the reader. As we read Lolita, we find ourselves disgustingly charmed by Humbert's prose. Nabokov hurled all of his talent at Humbert's explanations for his pedophilia. We certainly and hopefully do not agree with anything he says, but the package in which he delivers it is dangerously artful and charismatic. The book, again, is framed as an argument to a jury, as if Humbert will eventually present this as his case. So as we read Lolita, there are three audiences in the room: Humbert himself, the jury, and the reader. Humbert tries to ally himself with the reader. When he speaks to the jurors, he is cold and condescending. When he addresses the reader, he is jovial and comedic. So his memoir is littered with snide remarks about frigid gentlewomen of the jury, or facetious, mocking appeals to a group of jurors. These remarks are meant as a sort of wink-wink to the reader, establishing a jovial rapport that he hopes will gloss over his depravity. He repeatedly addresses the reading audience as learned reader, as if to flatter and foster this positive rapport. Humbert also claims the reader is patient and meek in comparison to Dolly. This serves to simultaneously flatter the reader and denigrate Dolly's character, pulling the audience to Humbert's side. Lolita is an undeniably comedic book, thanks to Humbert's prose. It was lauded for its humor upon first publication. Humbert is self-deprecating. He calls himself Humbert the Terrible. He says he is stupid, monstrous, or bestial, clearly to assuage sympathy from the reader. Humbert also pokes fun at American institutions and culture, providing remarks which forward-thinking readers would very likely have agreed with. In one instance, Humbert implores the reader to check the weather data so as to prove the veracity of an incident he is recounting. Presumably, this assuredness is meant to convince the reader that Humbert is reliable. His recollection lines up with documented reality. Of course, one instance of this being true should not be extended to the rest of the pages. What does the weather have to do with molesting an innocent child? Humbert, towards the end of the book, claims to have changed, that he is actually in love with Dolly, and that he regrets the way he treated her. Given all that we have learned, I find this tremendously difficult to believe. Some readers may disagree. But to examine Humbert is to examine only half of Lolita, so we must turn our attention to Dolly herself. Humbert is primarily interested in Dolly as a physical specimen, so the only solid information we have about her is just that, her physical appearance. Humbert discusses this at great length numerous times throughout the book. Frankly, these writings become quite tiresome, not as a reflection of Nabokov's prose, but instead as an indictment towards Humbert and his obsession. When Dolly speaks, her dialogue is more often summarized, categorized, and shooed aside rather than relayed directly to the reader. We are left with Humbert's judgments on her. But according to Humbert, our only source of information, Dolly is a normal 12-year-old girl. She likes movies, comics, magazines, tennis, roller skating, and boys. She is occasionally insolent towards her mother, and Humbert claims she has a gift for humor. Humbert cynically says she is the ideal consumer who would fall for every advertisement and billboard. Indeed, Humbert's assessment of Dolly's plainness is likely why he is drawn to her. Rather than seeing her as any individual with unique thoughts or feelings, Humbert sees Dolly as an idea. She is an adolescent girl, and that's it. Often people have accused Nabokov of misogyny with Lolita. They say that Dolly is a seductress who is given no other role than physical fulfillment for Humbert. But to say this is to side with Humbert. Every time Humbert describes Dolly's actions, he takes great pain to imbue them with some sensuality or coquette femme fatale quality. He molests her on the couch, and Humbert says she gives him an orgasm. Humbert drugs her and tries to rape her, yet it is somehow Dolly who seduces him. She holds an apple, and Humbert describes it as Eden red. Dolores confesses to a past sexual experience at summer camp. For this, Humbert categorizes her as an experienced temptress. When the book was originally published, many critics were quick to side with Humbert. One critic, Dorothy Parker, wrote that Dolly was a, quote, dreadful little creature, selfish, hard, vulgar, and foul-tempered. Another reader wondered in an article if he was meant to pity Dolly before concluding, she is a spoiled sub-teenager with a foul mouth, a self-offered target for lectures, movie magazine editors, and corrupt classmates. In addition to Humbert's laborious prose, this impression likely does come from events in the story. Dolly seems to enjoy his early attention. Dolly actively engages, awkwardly and by coercion, in flirtations and sexual experiments with Humbert at first. But when Humbert drugs, rapes, and kidnaps Dolly, their relationship becomes tyrannical. Humbert himself says she whimpered and protested when he raped her. He also says Dolly cries herself to sleep each and every night they are together. Certainly this is not the behavior of a young seductress. In one of Humbert's more honest moments, he writes, "At the hotel we had separate rooms, but in the middle of the night she came sobbing into mine, and we made it up very gently." You see, she had absolutely nowhere else to go. For much of the book, then, Dolly is simply trapped. We do learn more about Dolores later in the story. Her escape comes only when she turns to another adult male, the playwright named Claire Quilty. Attracted by his celebrity, Dolly runs away from Humbert with Claire. In the story's most tragic turn, Claire also does not care about Dolly as a person. After she refuses to star in his pornographic films, Claire loses interest altogether. Dolores sees Humbert again when she is 17 years old. She has found a normal life, married to an everyman named Dick Schiller and pregnant with his child. In this meeting, we learn quite a bit about Dolores. Dolly holds no venom for Quilty or even Humbert. Rather, she has lived for so long under the abuse of these men that anger has long since abated. Her suffering has become her life. It is a new modality of existence. Humbert implores her to leave with him, but she now has the strength to deny his blatant coercions. This is a triumph, but overall there is little to suggest she has come out stronger for Humbert's abuse. Her wounds will very likely linger for eternity. They have become indelible marks. Her former dreams of Hollywood stardom have been extinguished in favor of new aspirations. She just wants to be normal. Perhaps in some ways she even is normal. Pregnant, wed to a working-class man, and optimistic about her quiet life. We could say Dolly has achieved victory over her abuser, but her quiet life doesn't really reach its conclusion. Dolores dies in childbirth that Christmas. And so we are left with our understanding of Dolores. This is one of the most tragic parts of Lolita. Dolly is somehow rendered absent from the book. Even the title reflects not Dolly's personage, but Humbert's view of her. She is Lolita, right on the cover. Throughout the story, we have to crane and interpret to even get a vague picture of Dolores. And even when we do this, the resulting picture is not actually of Dolly. More accurately, we have only a picture of Humbert himself. Clearly, Lolita is a work of tragedy. It is heartbreaking and intense. But for a long time, and indeed today in some forms, Lolita is a word associated with sex appeal and forbidden lust. Given the content of the book itself, we must wonder, how did that happen? 5 American publishers turned down Nabokov when Lolita was finished, but the book was eventually published through a French company called Olympia Press. While the Americans had turned down the work on the basis of its controversial nature, Olympia Press specialized in these types of books. In fact, a large number of books published through Olympia were outright pornography. And so in September 1955, Lolita hit shelves. Critic Graham Greene named it one of the best books of the year in an article for the London-based Sunday Times. On the back of this, the book received an influx of attention, not all good. One critic called it sheer unrestrained pornography and publicly scolded Graham Greene and the Sunday Times for spreading pornographic materials. Shortly after, Lolita was banned by the French and British governments before even being published in the United States. When the book finally made its US debut, it received a largely positive response. And not long after, famed director Stanley Kubrick acquired the film rights to Lolita. Kubrick offered Nabokov a deal to write the screenplay. Nabokov initially rejected the proposition, but eventually was convinced to oblige. In 1960, Nabokov and Kubrick met to discuss the screenplay. The meeting was productive. Each seemed open to each other's suggestions. When Nabokov finished the screenplay, it was 400 pages long, and Kubrick estimated the resulting movie would have a 7-hour runtime. Nabokov edited the screenplay, and Kubrick was happy enough with the result. When Nabokov saw the resulting film, he was shocked. Kubrick had departed wildly from the screenplay Nabokov provided. Nabokov would later describe watching the film. It was a scenic drive as perceived by the horizontal passenger of an ambulance. Indeed, Kubrick's Lolita was a horrific distortion of Nabokov's work. Censorship laws at the time meant that Kubrick wasn't allowed to explore the sexual relationship between Humbert and Dolores. Without this, of course, there is no Lolita. It is true that Kubrick himself was not to blame for these laws, but a person has to wonder, possessing the knowledge of these laws, why even endeavor to make Lolita into a film? Certainly any reasonable individual would recognize that there was no way to meaningfully adapt Nabokov's work under those laws. Still, Kubrick had pressed onward. Kubrick's Lolita has very little of Nabokov's story. In the film, Dolores is aged up to 16 years old, which was deemed to be more acceptable than 12. The film has no references to Humbert's pedophilia. Rather, the movie is basically a charming romantic comedy. There is a bizarre, slapstick energy to the entire film. Perhaps Kubrick's Lolita is a good movie, but it is an intensely bad adaptation. Given the content of its source material, Kubrick's light-hearted movie feels somehow insidious and even grotesque. Still, Lolita was a major motion picture, complete with a major marketing budget. One of the most famous parts of its marketing campaign was this poster. Interestingly, the lollipop and heart-shaped glasses never appear in the movie, but when Kubrick's Lolita saw huge commercial and critical success, this image of its dolly became synonymous with the story of Lolita. The film, in popular culture, eclipsed the book. Quick to leverage this success, book publishers licensed the image for new prints of Lolita. Nabokov had always been quite controlling about the covers of his book. He had specified, "I want pure colors, melting clouds, accurately drawn details, a sunburst above a receding road with the light reflected in furrows and ruts after rain. And no girls. There is one subject which I am emphatically opposed to. Any kind of representation of a little girl." But thanks to powers beyond Nabokov, this image became Lolita's cover. This didn't just become the image of the movie, this was the image of the story. Pros be damned, Lolita now meant a teenage seductress. For years, Lolita was associated with, perhaps even synonymous with, highly sexualized teenage girls. Versions of the Oxford American Dictionary defined Lolita as a sexually precocious young girl. That dictionary also described the book's character as an attractive and sexually mature girl. The Police made their 1980 song Don't Stand So Close to Me, which references Nabokov alongside a story of romance between a schoolgirl and her teacher. Tennis star Anna Kournikova was nicknamed the Lobbing Lolita. This misinterpretation has infected adult entertainment as well. The term lolicon is used in Japan to describe an attraction to young girls, which has spawned movies, comics, and literature. Of course, all of these represent a wild distortion of Nabokov's work. Throughout the years, Lolita has been misinterpreted time and time again. In the interest of leaving no stone unturned, we should examine some of these erroneous critiques. Lolita was not written to champion Humbert or his pedophilia. Nabokov is not Humbert. Quite the opposite. Nabokov seems to hold nothing but disdain for his narrator. Earlier, we briefly discussed Nabokov's essay on a book entitled Lolita. In this, he states that he disagrees with Humbert on many things, including, but not limited to, the narrator's assessment of so-called nymphettes. Additionally, if we examine Nabokov's existence as an artist, we find a clear line of hatred between him and Humbert. The narrator claims his attraction to Dolly has some artistic, aesthetic core. He self-describes, if you recall, as an artist and a madman. With that in mind, he manipulates and uses Dolly as some kind of instrument to his allegedly artistic ends. He sees Dolly not as a person, but a tool, a device. For Humbert, his artistic pursuit meant he could do whatever he pleased. This mode of thinking had become prevalent among turn-of-the-century creatives, this idea that artists had free dominion over all in their aesthetic quests. Nabokov harshly disagreed with this concept. He believed that artists should have freedom to shape subjects for their own aesthetic ends, but Nabokov did not believe artists had the right to harm their subjects. For Nabokov, artistic pursuits did not override basic humanity, and so Humbert is foundationally at odds with Nabokov's moral code. Lolita is also not a love story. Even the most basic reading of the text informs us of this, despite what some critics have said about the work throughout the years. Humbert claims to be in love with Dolly, sure, but here we return to our unreliable narrator. Humbert says a lot of things. There's very little in this book to indicate any amount of romantic love. If a reader interprets Lolita as a love story, I would personally be inclined to question that reader's idea of love itself. Lolita is also not a salacious piece of pornography. There's very little erotica in the book. Nabokov has a firm understanding of pornographic prose. With this understanding, he intentionally made Lolita quite unpornographic. After an initial bit of erotica, the book becomes clearly character-driven. There's almost no sex in it at all. Instead, physical moments are spoken about in vague, sweeping language. Lolita is not about empowering pedophilia. It is not about romance or even eroticism. In its narrative content, Lolita is about abuse. It is about a narcissistic, disgusting individual who manipulates and rapes an innocent young girl. For many readers, this may be the primary takeaway from Lolita, and that's perfectly reasonable. But I think in Lolita's construction, we can arrive at other themes. Lolita is about language. It is about reality itself. It is about the distinction between how events unfold and how they are communicated. As we read the book, we experience some of the most beautiful, charming, and mesmerizing prose the English language has ever produced. We laugh at Humbert's jokes and we bask in his mastery of his craft. But when we take a step back, we see that all of these pieces have been assembled to produce a giant, disgusting lie. In Lolita, we collect the beautiful, only to walk away with the horrific. This is perhaps a lesson we should always keep in our back pocket. Lolita is check your sources, distilled into the finest, most violent, and most horrific pinpoint that could ever hope to be achieved. Whether it is the seduction of a 12-year-old girl or our nightly news report, the lesson of Lolita remains true. Things we are told may not be the things that happen. This is the very nature of manipulation, and indeed Lolita is manipulation, as told by the manipulator himself.